Hey everyone! In this video you will see the top 5 best tech trees in World of Tanks. The main criteria for selecting trees were the comfort of playing on tanks from 6 to 9 tiers, the number of researchable modules, and the relevance of a tier 10 tank. It's also worth noting that this video is the second part. So, if you will not see some worthy branches here, most likely, it was in the first part. Well, let's begin. In 5th place is American Heavy Tanks tree of the T110E5. Frankly, I thought about including this tree in the first part, but found more worthy candidates. Now, against the background of remaining tech trees, this tree definitely deserves to be in this top, though in 5th place. On tier 6 is the M6. It's a pretty boring tank, without any weighty strengths, but with a lot of weaknesses. It is huge, its armor is weak. Any enemies, including tier 5, have no problem to penetrate this tank in the forehead. Mobility is more or less not bad, but this tank is not exactly fast. The same can be said about the gun. Standard, as for tier 6 gun, with damage per shot is 240. In general, this is a dull and boring tank, which you just need to endure. After all, on tier 7 unlocks the awesome T29. It has an incredibly strong turret, which allows you to play comfortably even against tier 9 tanks. Plus, a pretty good gun, though not most powerful. The only minus is the mobility, but it's not critical. In general, in my opinion, this is the best heavy tank on tier 7. You'll have a lot of fun playing it. The next is the T32. Many players don't like this tank, however I don't consider it a bad tank. It's essentially the same T29, just with a bit of improved mobility, armor, and gun. Of course, T32 is not as good on its own tier, as T29 is on its own, but you won't feel much discomfort. On the 9th tier is the M103. A long time ago, it was a horrible tank, which everyone laughed at. But then it got an upgrade, and now it's pretty good. Nice stabilization and damage per minute. Not bad armor. Among the clear minuses, is a weak turret armor. And, the T110E5. Probably, the most versatile tank in the game. It has an excellent gun in all respects. Good mobility. Strong armor. In general, it's a really cool tank. It has only one disadvantage, it's a huge hatch, which is a vulnerability. So, the American Heavy Tanks tree is a great choice for those who want simple and active in gameplay tanks. This tree only ranked 5th because one of the main features of those tanks is high damage per minute and low damage per shot. In fact, if you're a beginner, it will be much easier to play tanks with high damage per shot. That's exactly what the next tree is good for. The American Tank Destroyer tree of the T110E4. On 6th tier is the legendary Hellcat. It's a very old tank, which many times got buffs and debuffs. Now it's a typical tank destroyer, with classic passive gameplay. It has no armor, but has a great camouflage. As for the firepower, it is exactly the same gun as the M6. Also on the plus side is very good mobility. In general, as said before, this is a classic tank destroyer, and its gameplay is all about standing in the bushes. For beginners this is quite a difficult tank, because there is no armor, but you will play it for not long, because it's only tier 6. Next comes the T25-2. This is a full copy of the Hellcat, with the same characteristics and the same gameplay. But on tier 8 the situation changes radically. T28 prototype already has strong armor, and a pretty powerful gun. But, unfortunately, beginning with tier 8, all the tanks in this tree become very slow. And along with this, changes their gameplay. T28 prototype is no longer a tank destroyer. It's a full-fledged heavy tank, with active gameplay. The same applies to the T30, which is tier 9. In fact, it's a very cool tank. It has a weak hull, but a pretty strong turret. And also incredibly powerful gun, with average damage per shot of 750. In short, it's the T29, with the T95 gun. I'm sure, this tank will enjoy a lot of players. On tier 10 is the T110E4. First of all, It is worth reminding that this is a heavy tank, and you should play it as a heavy tank. After all, it has pretty good armor, and a very powerful gun. The main advantage of such high damage per shot is that it's easy to do a lot of damage. Just think about it, 4 successful shots is almost 3000 damage. Plus, great average penetration. By the way, I forgot to say that all the tanks in this tree have a turret, so they are very comfortable to play. Well, let's move on. In third place is the 60 TP Polish heavy tank tree. On the 6 and 7 tiers are 40 TP and 45 TP. These are the most ordinary and unremarkable tanks. They are simple in gameplay, and don't have any outstanding pluses or minuses. Just pass it and forget about it. On tier 8 is 53 TP. This vehicle is already more interesting. The damage per shot is 420. It also has not bad armor and mobility. In general, this is a normal heavy tank, with well-balanced characteristics. It's also worth noting that against the background of some IS-3, Tiger II and other old heavy tanks, 53 TP looks and feels fresher and more enjoyable. So, I think you'll like this tank. On tier 9 is the 50 TP. It already has more serious firepower. After all, the damage per shot is 560. This is quite a lot, as for a tier 9 heavy tank. It's also worth noting that the armor became much stronger, but it has its own features, which we'll talk about a bit later. In general, if you are a beginner, and have little game experience, this tank will definitely not disappoint you. So, the top tank of this tree is 60 TP. It has a very powerful gun, with an average damage per shot of 750. This is its main strength. After all, as said before, it's easier to implement high one-time damage per shot than high damage per minute. The second plus is armor. But it's specific. The thing is that it has a lot of vulnerabilities, but they are small and quite hard to hit. That is, this armor is random. In some battle you'll have a lot of block damage, just because enemy rounds won't hit the vulnerabilities. And in another battle, you may die in a few seconds. The same applies to the 50 TP. But still, this armor often works, and it's generally better than the T110E4. That's why this tree is ranked number 3. In second place is Soviet light tanks tree of the T100LT. I'm sure, many players are now surprised, because beginners can't play light tanks, it's so hard. Everything is very simple. The light tanks of tier 8, 9 and 10 in this tree have armor. But first things first. On 6th tier is the MT-25. This funny looking tank once came to replace the legendary T-52, but players didn't like this tank, for obvious reasons. It's huge. And that's unacceptable for a light tank. But this is only 6th tier, so it's not worth focusing on it. On tier 7 is the ugly LTG. It already looks more like a light tank, although its looks also leaves much to be desired. In short, this is another common light tank that you need to endure, to get the cool LTTB. Beginning with this tank, you get really interesting gameplay, as mobility has gotten better, firepower has also increased. And also the armor has appeared. Oh, if you only knew how many times, playing tier 10 tanks I didn't penetrate the crazy LTTB players. It's a really good and very interesting tank. I'm sure you'll like it. Next up is the T-54 LTVT. This is a kind of hybrid of light and medium tanks. Playing this tank, you can train your skills on medium tanks, so that later it will be easier for you to master this vehicle class. And finally, the T-100LT. It, as well as LTTB and T-54 LTVT, has excellent mobility, and very good armor. As for a light tank, of course, you should not rely on it, just sometimes it will save you. Just keep this fact in mind, and play more aggressively, take positions to fire, to detect enemies, play actively, and all that. Also worth noting, I put this tree in second place because the tanks from tier 7 to tier 9 have really few researchable modules. And grinding this tree will be very easy. In about a week you can get the T100LT, if you have premium account. In first place is another, third American tree. This time it's the T110E3 heavy tanks tree. Like this video, if you too think it's ridiculous how stupid monkeys are standing in a bush at the base, playing this tank, thinking that it's a tank destroyer. But this doesn't apply to every tank in this tree. For example, the Jackson, which is tier 6, is almost a replica of the Hellcat, and it can still be played passively, because there is no armor. The same applies to the next vehicle, T25AT. It's fair to say that it is a pretty poor tank, and it will be hard to play it, because it has no armor, no turret, and no powerful gun. You just need to endure it. But on 8th tier you'll unlock the T28. It's a very strong tank. It has a nice gun, with good accuracy and damage per minute. Incredibly strong frontal armor, though with some vulnerabilities. Among the weaknesses is obviously horrible mobility. But this problem is partly solved by using a turbocharger. If you have a little game experience, you will like this tank very much, because it's easy to gameplay. The same can be said about the T95. After all, it has the same strengths as the T28. Seriously, in terms of gameplay these are the easiest tanks. All you need to do, is just drive forward and fire. There are vulnerabilities, but they are very small and pretty hard to hit. The penetration of basic and premium rounds is very high, because these are tank destroyers. Damage per shot is also high. Again, the only minus is mobility, so you must definitely use a turbocharger. And, finally, the T110E3. It has a bigger vulnerability in the form of the hull bottom, but the hatch armor increased up to 370mm. But the frontal armor of this tank is not just strong, it's impenetrable. If you hide the bottom of the hull, enemies' heavy and medium tanks can absolutely nothing against you. And that's the point. Simplicity. You don't need to think about how to implement the damage per minute, thanks to high damage per shot. You don't need to know the vulnerabilities of tanks, because the average penetration is very nice. I hope you get my point. Well, thank you for watching this video to the end, I hope you found it useful. It's time to say goodbye. Good luck to everyone, and remember, don't play World of Tanks.